There is one simple, very inexpensive test that can tell you more about your risk of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementia than any other test. Yet, when you ask your doctor to perform it, they'll usually tell you it's useless or even get angry. Today, I'm going to explain exactly why this test could save your life and why you must have it done. Hello, health champions. Today, we're going to talk about the one test which, compared to standard tests, can give you a 20-year head start on health and prevention. So here's how it usually works. You have your annual checkup and the tests come back and they're telling you that your glucose is fine. It's under 99. It's in range. They tell you that your hemoglobin A1C is less than 5.7. So yeah, you're looking good. And your triglycerides are under 150. So you're fine. And then they summarize and say, your health is fine. We'll see you next year. And this keeps happening until 1 year. They tell you, I'm afraid that you now have diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And your first thought is, of course, well, how is that possible when I was fine last year? Well, the problem is that you weren't really fine last year. They just didn't check the right stuff. So the test I'm talking about is a fasting insulin test, and you can walk into a lab and pay out of pocket $25 to $35 to get it done. And it can be even less if you bundle it with other markers. So let me just give you some numbers for comparison. For example, they have spent over $1 trillion since 1971 on the war on cancer. And I'm not opposed to that. I think it's great that they're making progress on cancer research. I think it's great that we learn about cancer. But what if they had spent just a few dollars on an insulin test? Then they could actually have saved millions of people with spending very, very little money. And here's another astronomical number that you may have heard of or maybe not, but they spent in 2025, $5.6 trillion on so-called healthcare, or rather sick care, in the United States. So if you divide that out by the number of people, that's $16,000 per person per year. And that includes people of all ages, including infants and kids and so forth. So for a family of 5, that is $80,000 a year that they spend on medical bills. And I believe that if we gave everyone a fasting insulin test, if that became a standard, then we could easily cut that total bill, that 5.6 trillion. We could probably cut it in half or even lower. And just how big a problem is it? Well, once you test your fasting insulin and you get the results, you want that number to be between 2 and 5. That's ideal. So how many people are in that range? Well, if you check the people over 5, the ones who are not optimal, then 70 to 80% of them in the US are going to be above that. So they're going to be not ideal. And the US is not even the worst in the world anymore. There are other countries that are just as bad or worse. And if we look at the world globally, then 60 to 70% of all the people in the world are outside of this ideal range. So let's just understand the basics of insulin. Insulin is basically the key that unlocks the door for sugar to get into the cell. We hear so much about blood sugar, but that's just the transportation vehicle. It's just the pipeline to get the glucose where it needs to go. It's insulin that brings it into the cell where it can be used. So where does insulin become a problem? Well, if insulin knocks on the door, great. And 10,000 years ago, then we would have maybe 1 or 2 meals and insulin would knock once or twice a day. But today, that doesn't happen anymore. And with our modern lifestyle, we basically have insulin knocking on that door all day long because we eat 3 meals or more. We eat snacks. We have sippy cups. We get the sweet coffee drinks from Starbucks and so on. So we have maybe 10, 15, 20 times that we get an insulin spike. And now the body gets overwhelmed. It's designed for 1 to 2 knocks per day because that's been the case for hundreds of thousands of years. And now in just the last few generations, 2 to 3 generations, we've turned all of that upside down. And now what happens when insulin comes knocking all day long, then the cell is going to be annoyed and it's going to develop resistance to insulin called insulin resistance. It's not that complicated. And everything that gets overwhelmed, everything that gets too much of something is going to develop resistance. You would too. If somebody came knocking on your door, then once would be nice to get some company, but if they kept knocking all day, then you would stop answering, just like the cell does. So now the body's response is to make more insulin. If a certain dose of insulin isn't doing the job anymore because the cell is resistant, now we have to up the dose. In other words, we knock louder and we increase that insulin resistance. And as a result now, insulin is bringing the blood glucose down. So we have normal blood glucose, but we have high insulin. However, at the annual checkup, then they just keep testing the blood glucose, not the insulin. So we have to realize that there are 2 separate problems here. The first problem is high blood glucose. And yes, it's a big problem. However, which we're going to talk about in detail, is high insulin is a much bigger problem. And yet, mainstream medicine only looks at the blood glucose, and they keep testing that. And if you watch this video or videos like this and you figure, hey, I need to get my insulin tested, and you go and ask your doctor to have it performed, then typically what's going to happen is that they tell you, no, we don't do that because it's a useless test, or it doesn't really tell us anything. And in some cases, they even get angry that you would ask such a thing. And the reason I know this happens a lot is I've had hundreds of people over the years who have gone to ask for their test, and they're met with exactly these reactions. So if insulin is an even bigger problem than blood glucose, let's understand the damage that it does. And the first one is that high insulin creates low-grade chronic inflammation. And you can think of this as you go park your car, but it doesn't turn off. It stays idling. And maybe it even stays idling at 2,000 RPMs. And now what's going to happen is you generate a lot of heat and a lot of wear and tear. And normally what inflammation is supposed to do is inflammation is associated with immune responses. And when they happen short term, like they're supposed to, then they're for the purpose of healing. They set up the circumstances, the conditions for healing to take place. And then the body heals it. And now we have a resolution. We get the final result, which is healthy tissue. And then the inflammation can go down and reset to a previous normal level. However, when we have long-term inflammation, such as from high insulin, now we set up the parameters for healing, but there is no resolution. We don't get to that final point, and therefore the inflammation becomes chronic. And as a result of chronic inflammation, the immune system never gets to calm down and rest. And this is the foundation for about 90% or more of all chronic disease, which we'll talk about. And there's several mechanisms where insulin contributes to cardiovascular disease. The first one has to do with sodium and water retention. So high insulin tells the kidneys to increase sodium retention. We always filter out sodium, but then we bring back in like 99% or more. But with high insulin, we reabsorb even more. We reabsorb too much. And then what happens is that sodium and water always go together. Sodium is the primary extracellular electrolyte, and its purpose, one of its purposes is to bind water, to have an osmotic pull on water. So now with more sodium and more water, we're going to increase the fluid volume in your vascular system, which is a fixed volume. Now with a larger fluid volume, we're going to increase the blood pressure. And with increased blood pressure, now we increase the friction inside the blood vessels, especially where they make little kinks and turns. So now we damage these blood vessels, and this is one of the ways that we can develop a stroke. But this high blood pressure also damage the kidneys, because the kidneys is full of tiny little blood vessels. And with a damaged kidney, now we have an even lower capacity to regulate the blood pressure. First, it is affected by the high insulin, but now when the kidney is damaged, it does even worse a job. And this becomes a vicious cycle, which is why high insulin or insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, which all the same thing, is the number one cause of kidney failure and dialysis. But it's important that we point out something here, that there is a normal mechanism in the body called pressure diuresis. So with normal insulin and normal amounts of sodium reabsorption, the increased pressure that we see, the increased blood pressure, it takes care of itself. It simply pushes the fluid out through the kidneys and it doesn't get reabsorbed. But with the high insulin, now that's not a normal situation. So like we said, the insulin creates an abnormally high reabsorption. So it actually overrides this normal mechanism. And that's why people think sodium has gotten a bad rap, but it's not the sodium. Sodium is an innocent bystander. It's just getting pushed around. It's the kidney that is confused by the high insulin. So if there's a simple test that can help us prevent the number one cause of kidney failure, is that useless? The second way it does damage is through blood vessel damage. So inflammation itself can create direct endothelial damage. So this is like a chemical friction that starts eating away at the inside of the blood vessels. That's the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel. And that damage is kind of like we're scratching the lining and we're getting rough spots. And the body is really good at healing things, so it tries to patch this up. And the body sends out cholesterol to patch it up. And what is the carrier that carries cholesterol to these rough spots? It's the LDL carrier. It's the low density lipoprotein that brings cholesterol to patch it. So it's not a bad thing. LDL is just doing its job in an appropriate way for the given conditions. But over time, this inflammation and this rough spots and this damage can create plaques, because if we keep laying down more and more cholesterol, that can become a plaque. And eventually, especially if these plaques grow fast, then they may rupture, and now that's what gives us a heart attack, and it's also another mechanism for a stroke. The third way is through blood clotting. So when we have high insulin, it's going to increase the amount of fibrinogen and other clotting factors. So what happens is the blood gets stickier, it clumps together, the particles in the blood clump together and create more clots. And these clots can get loose and dislodge, and this is another way that we can cause heart attacks and strokes. And this is why insulin is a much stronger risk factor for heart disease than cholesterol ever is. And cholesterol in itself is not a risk factor. It's the inflammation that damages the cholesterol that really turns cholesterol into a problem at all. So if there's a simple test that can help us identify major causes of heart disease, would that be useless? And then there's osteoarthritis. And it is not just wear and tear. That's how most people think about it. They say, I have this body, when I use it, it wears down and it only lasts so long. That's the wrong way to look at it, because your body is in a constant balance of breaking down. Cells wear out and you constantly break down and rebuild. You replace 90% of your cells every single year. And so it is with joints and cartilage as well. They break down, they rebuild. However, Joints and cartilage has very poor blood flow. The blood flow goes to the outside of the joint. It doesn't go inside the joint. So the cartilage and the inside of the joint doesn't have direct blood supply. The blood gets to the outside and the nutrients and the oxygen get across by diffusion. So in order for the joints and the cartilage to get nutrients and oxygen, it relies on fluid exchange. It's a diffusion across that capsule. But here's why insulin is a problem. Insulin creates inflammation, and chronic inflammation is going to change the chemistry of the fluids in the body. So the fluid becomes more acidic, and now we're increasing the breakdown. So we're shifting that balance between breakdown and building up. And adding insult to injury, insulin resistance is also the primary cause of obesity and weight gain. So now, not only is the joint not healing properly, it's breaking down faster, but we're putting an extra load on it as well. So osteoarthritis is made worse by the combination of chemical and mechanical insult. Now, if there was a simple test that could help us understand and reduce insulin resistance and help both of these problems, don't you think that would have some value? Would that really be useless? Now, there's two ways high insulin contributes to cancer. And the first is through the immune suppression. And mutations are very common in the body. So you have 40 trillion cells. You replace 90% of them every year on average. And every time that you make a new cell, when you copy all that DNA, then 1 in so many billions becomes a mutation. So they're very, very common. But then your body has a defense system. First of all, it can repair DNA. But then if that fails, we also have natural killer cells and T cells as part of the immune system that seek out and destroy abnormal cells. But with high insulin and chronic inflammation, now we reduce the number and the activity of these immune cells, of these defense cells. And as a result, we're going to have more potential cancer cells slip through and be left alone to do their thing. The second way insulin contributes is that insulin is a mitogenic hormone. And what does that mean? Well, mitosis is about cell division. It's about cell proliferation and growth. And mitogenic means that it is something that drives that process, that speeds up that cell division. So in other words, insulin stimulates growth and cell division. Now, the difference between cancer and normal cells is that normal cells are well behaved. They have regulatory mechanisms that they answer to. So they will only grow to a certain point. They'll only grow so much because they're regulated by other factors. However, cancer cells are very different in that they have lost all that control. They're renegades. They don't listen to anybody. They just keep multiplying no matter how big they get until they eventually destroy the host. And now if you combine insulin and sugar, then that is like throwing gasoline on the fire in terms of cancer. And this is especially true for breast cancer, colon cancer, and pancreatic cancer. But there's one more problem as well. And that is that if we increase the rate of mitosis, if we speed up the cell divisions, now there's also going to be a larger number of mutations because there's a certain rate, 1 mutation per so many billion cell divisions. Well, if we make more cell divisions, we're going to have more mutations. And with an increased number of mutations that the cancer cells go through, the more mutations they go through, the worse they get, the less like a normal cell they are. And those are the cells that have the highest risk of kind of splitting off and just washing away and becoming metastases. So there's a simple, inexpensive test that can help us reduce the risk of cancer and metastasis. I don't think that sounds completely useless. And then there is Alzheimer's disease, dementia. And what insulin does is that when insulin is too high, insulin resistance makes the brain deaf to insulin. Like we talked about earlier, when insulin comes a knocking and nobody is listening, if the brain is deaf to that signal, now the brain is going to be starving. It's not going to be able to get that fuel. And what we want to understand is that these brain cells will starve despite the fact that the blood glucose, the levels of glucose in the blood is very high, but inside the cells it can be very low. And brain cells are more dependent on glucose than any other cell in the body. You have 2% of the body weight in the brain, but it uses 20 to 25% of all your energy. So because it's so sensitive, when it doesn't get the fuel when it's starving, then these brain cells will degenerate and die, which is the primary mechanism for dementia. But there's one more way that high insulin hurts the brain. Remember that it is stimulating growth. So it's also going to increase the production of beta amyloid protein. And this protein has the tendency to clump together and make plaques inside the brain. So you can think about this, it's like getting gunk between the gears in an engine. And in the brain, what it does, it interferes with the signal transmission. So there's two mechanisms where insulin damages the brain, and one is through building plaques and one is through starving the brain. And this is where we get that loss of memory. Now, if there's an inexpensive, simple test that can help us understand and prevent that, is that really useless? And then there's obesity, stubborn weight. So with high insulin, it promotes both fat production and fat storage. And the reverse of that is that it also prevents fat burning. It reduces it. So here we have three different factors to promote obesity that comes from high insulin. And one way you can think about this is like you're saving up. You're trying to save energy. It's like putting money into a vault, into a safe, and then you close it up and you throw away the key. But in the case of obesity, in case of insulin, it doesn't just happen once, it happens over and over and over every day. And because of that, high insulin actually makes you hungry. Obese people often get blamed for being gluttonous or having poor character or no willpower, but it's a hormone that dictates your behavior. Like we said previous with the vault analogy, if high insulin stores fat and then prevents us from accessing that fat, that's the whole purpose of storing fat. It's future energy reserves, but with high insulin, we can't get to them. So with no access to all those energy reserves, we're going to have a lack of energy. We're not going to be able to pull on those to make our ongoing everyday energy. And the body has to have energy. So what's the solution? Well, at this point, all you could do is to eat more food. And when you already have high insulin and you eat more food, now what happens is, of course, insulin gets even higher. And now we got this vicious cycle where it stores even more fat and locks it away even more, and so on. And this is why calorie counting diets do not work. They could work for a few days or a few weeks, but they can't work long term because your fat stores, your fat reserves, your energy reserves are hormonally locked down. And this is why intermittent fasting and low carb diets actually work, because they work on the real mechanism. They actually lower insulin. With intermittent fasting, when you go longer between meals, now insulin drops significantly when you're not eating. And when you're eating low carb, now it doesn't rise as much. So that allows your body to address the real problem. So in other words, those diets basically help lift the lock. So if there's a simple, inexpensive test that could help you understand stubborn weight probably better than any other tool, would that be useless? PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is something that affects women and causes infertility, heavy bleedings, and painful cycles. And what happens is that excess insulin creates higher levels of testosterone in women. And it's a male hormone, but women are supposed to have a little bit, but not too much. And that high testosterone is going to interfere with and disrupt the very delicate balance of female hormones. And as a result, we're going to have irregular periods and infertility, but you could also get things like acne and facial hair and even male pattern baldness. So if there's a simple test that can help us understand the number one cause of infertility in women, would that be useless? And then there's NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the number one liver disease in the world today. And it's caused by high insulin, because high insulin causes de novo lipogenesis, which basically means making fat from scratch. So most people think that we get fat from eating fat. That's myth that's been around for a long time, but we actually get fat primarily from eating sugar, because we can't make fat and store fat without insulin, and sugar is the thing that drives insulin. So the combination of sugar and insulin is what creates fat, especially in the liver. So this making fat from scratch happens everywhere in the body, but especially in the liver. And when liver cells fill up with fat, they become more insulin resistant. They signal insulin resistance. And then these liver cells are basically becoming dysfunctional with that increased insulin resistance. And now, in turn, they start signaling increased TNF-alpha and interleukin-6. And all you need to know is that those are inflammatory signaling molecules. So we're driving more inflammation again. And as a result, we increase insulin resistance in the rest of the body from that fatty liver. And then, of course, that insulin resistance is going to make even more insulin and create even more fat in the liver. So we have another vicious cycle. So if there's a simple test that can help us screen for the number one most common liver disease in the world, would that be useless? And now let's understand type 2 diabetes, how it develops. And type 2 diabetes is really nothing more than late stage insulin resistance. And there are two markers we need to understand, and that's the glucose, where the lab range, where you're considered normal, is between 65 and 99, and insulin, which they don't test, but there's still a lab range that says that you should be between 2.5 and 25. And that is a very large range. There is absolutely no way that 10 times as much insulin as 2.5 would be normal or okay. So let me give you an example of how this can progress over time. And we'll start with two really good numbers, a glucose of 85 and an insulin of 3. If you had these values, you would be very insulin sensitive and very metabolically healthy. You'd be at very low risk for all of these conditions that we discussed. But next year, you go to your annual checkup and your glucose is 90, but you don't know what your insulin is because they didn't check it. Chances are it could have doubled, maybe over a year, maybe over 3-4 years. And what this means is you doubled your insulin in order to keep your glucose in check. Glucose is the control variable. So in essence, it looks like nothing changed, but you just became twice as insulin resistant. But again, they don't check it. They tell you come back next year, and next year or a few years later, your glucose is 95. You're still in the lab range. They're telling you it's perfect. Don't worry about it. And then next year or a couple of years down the road, you're at 99 and you're still in the optimal range, or in the lab range rather. And they tell you that, oh, don't worry about it. You're looking good. Because as long as you're in the lab range, there are no flags on your lab report. And if there are no flags, they don't even read the report most of the time. And then you come back for your annual checkup, and now you're at 101. So this is the first time you get a flag, and you are just outside of the lab range with your 101. So now they classify you as pre-diabetic. And if you don't change something, then you're probably going to be a full-blown diabetic within 4 to 5 years. That's the typical scenario. But they're just going to tell you, hey, watch what you're eating, eat lots of carbohydrates, eat a low-fat diet, get some exercise, and lose some weight. Very, very general advice that doesn't really give you much direction. And you come back next year or a few years later, like I said, maybe 4 to 5 years, and now your glucose is 126 and you are a type 2 diabetic. But here's what we need to understand. When we look at these yellow bars, that's the glucose, see how little they change, because it is a controlled variable. It is critical for the body to keep it in that range, to keep it within this range. It's only going to go outside of that range when your entire metabolic system has crashed, when it has failed, because it makes more and more insulin in order to keep it controlled. And we're not going to see significant changes until the system fails. And that is why glucose is such a useless marker to test for type 2 diabetes and for insulin resistance. You're missing the point. You're wasting 20 years where you could have done something about it. And if we instead measured insulin, a very simple, inexpensive test, then we would have been able to follow this progress and see that it's almost a linear progression, and we would have been able to catch it before it ever became a problem. And here's another point that they completely miss. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, obesity, and osteoarthritis are caused by insulin, not by blood glucose. So if there is a simple, inexpensive test that can help you identify the #1 metabolic disease in the world that is creating most of our degenerative disease, and we could catch that and do something 20 years earlier, would that be useless? Well, actually, if you're asking me, I think it could have some value, but then again, that's just me. So in other words, get it tested. And first you could try asking your doctor, and if you get any sort of resistance, if he refuses or says, no, that's not what we do, it's useless, then you give him this video. Actually, don't do that, because that's just going to make them angry or irritated. What you do instead is you find a doctor that is actually interested in your health and understand what we're talking about here, or you can go and pay for it yourself. It's $25 to $35. I'm going to put a link down below if you want to order it from us, or you can just go to one of these places where you can walk in the door and give them a few dollars. Now, some of you may want to find out a little bit more. I think it's totally okay if you just want to run a quick check on insulin. But if you want to know more, then we also have a comprehensive panel for $387 where you get 60, 70 different markers. You get very detailed markers for cholesterol and heart disease risk. We measure the size of the cholesterol. We give you an NMR analysis and lots of other good stuff. And then you can also add a consultation if you get these tests and you want a little help understanding what it means. Then you can have that option if you really want to dig into it. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.